Thank you, Ed. Thank you so much for inviting me to give a talk here. I study the environment, so I think it's a nice addition to the first talk, really. And I look at child adversity in that, because actually child adversity is a really prevalent thing that occurs in up to 50% of children and adolescents growing up worldwide. And child adversity ranges from a single or more episodes of parental psychopathology to peer bullying, victimization, financial difficulties, and of course child abuse and neglect. And we know that child adversity has a really strong link to the development of later psychopathology. We know that about 45% of all childhood onset forms of psychopathology are linked to child adversity in early life. And we also know that those individuals with a history of adversity that have a mental health disorder actually have a more severe, more chronic, and a more recurrent disorder. So it's really important to investigate how we can reduce the prevalence of stress-related or adversity-related mental health disorders. And that is really what we try and do in our lab. Kind of just to try and investigate why certain children with a history of maltreatment develop mental health disorders. And in doing that, we wanted to investigate the effect of adversity in the form of abuse and neglect on the brain, because the brain orchestrates your responses to stress, your emotion regulation. So it's a really important organ, of course. And we know that the brain is crucial in responding to stress. So during an acute stressful event, imagine walking around in the woods and a bear is approaching you. Your body is made up in such a way that you see the body, the bear, without even being aware of the bear. So your brain shifts from higher order thinking to really quick detecting of threat in your environment, which is good. It's an adaptive response, but if the bear is in your home environment and is there every single day, that might impact on how your brain develops. And we know that in childhood and adolescence, the brain is very much developing, and there are all these different structures have differential developmental trajectories. So it might be that if you have a significant amount of stress during a period of time where any of these structures are developing, that impacts on the development of the brain. And we know that studies in animals where you can actually causally examine the effects of stress on the brain have shown that indeed early life stress in the form of maternal separation or isolation rearing impacts on the growth of the brain, and specifically reductions in dendrite length and branching, suppression of neurogenesis, and downregulation of gene expression has been found in certain brain areas, specifically the limbic system, the hippocampus and the amygdala, and the prefrontal cortex. And these regions are really important for emotional brain functioning in humans. So we wanted to investigate whether or not we would find similar effects in humans. And we did. So this is a sample of 181 adults with either depression, anxiety disorder, or no psychopathology at all. And we found that those individuals who reported a history of child maltreatment had a smaller dorsal medial prefrontal cortex. And it wasn't the case that they had a smaller prefrontal cortex when they reported maltreatment that happened only sometimes, but it was the case that when they reported it to have happened regularly or more often than that, we found this reduction in the volume of the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex. And this is interesting because of the important role that the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex plays in emotion regulation, stress response, and also self-referential processing, which means how you think about yourself and others. And we know that individuals with a history of maltreatment think really negatively about themselves. And we also know from other studies that reductions in the structure of a brain region might be related to functioning in the altered functioning in that same region. So we wanted to study whether or not the reduction in the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex was also related to altered functioning in the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex or in other regions that are related to it, that are modulated by it. And one particular region of interest is the amygdala. So I'll tell you something about two types of brain functioning that we assessed, and we start with emotional phase processing. And the amygdala is really crucial for emotional phase processing. And emotional phase processing is really important in the context of childhood adversity in the family environment, because if you're able to quickly detect when your parent is in a bad mood, that might help you avoid a negative confrontation with that parent. And we know that the amygdala kind of facilitates this quick response. But we also know from the animal literature that over time this response might lead to a persistent hypervigilant response in the amygdala. So we wanted to know whether or not we could find support for the idea that there would be amygdala hypervigilance in adults with a history of child maltreatment. And this is indeed the case. So when we showed adults emotional faces, so either angry or neutral or happy or sad faces, regardless of the valence of the face, we found that those individuals with a history of maltreatment had increased reactivity in the amygdala, regardless of whether or not they had a current psychopathology or whether or not they did not have any psychopathology at all. So it was really related to child maltreatment. And this is interesting because it's in line with findings in animals that maternal separation is associated with enhanced fear response in animals. And it's also in line with a longitudinal study where they tested soldiers who went out to combat in Iraq. And they tested them and they looked at their brain responses to emotional phases before and after deployment. And what they found is that deployment significantly increased amygdala reactivity to threatening material. But the increase was predicted by perceived level of threat and not by actual level of threat. So the interpretation that people give to the stressor is really crucial in determining neurobiological responses to salient information later on. This finding was also a replication of has also been replicated later by many other studies now. So this is actually a really well-known finding that child maltreatment is related with later hypervigilant responses in the amygdala. So it really seems to suggest that child maltreatment leads to a lasting enhancement of the amygdala towards the detection of emotional facial expressions. And so that might be helpful when the environment is stressful, but when the environment is no longer stressful, such a hypervigilant response might actually be detrimental and might prove to be a vulnerability factor for the development of psychopathology. So in another study, we wanted to investigate how individuals with a history of maltreatment deal with later stress, with actual stressful events on an interpersonal level. And the reason for that is that chronic rejection from your parents is part and parcel to adversity in the family environment. And we also know that that peer rejection increases sensitivity towards future rejection. So if you're rejected in the past, makes you more vulnerable to more rejection in the future. And we know that individuals that are high in this rejection sensitivity have a tendency to overreact to social rejection, both on a behavioral level, but also on a neural level. And we also know that neural responses to peer rejection are related to the development of mental health disorders later on in life. So we had a group of inpatients in the Netherlands, and we invited them to come to the lab, and we did a bit of a nasty thing. We had them play a game where they were being rejected by their peers. And what we found when we looked at their brain is this, and I'll explain to you what this means. So the individuals that reported maltreatment had more activity in the red blob there, and you'll recognize that is the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex. So they had more activity in this dorsal medial prefrontal cortex. The other two regions, the green one and the green regions, were related with the task, so being rejected in general. So that was what we call task-related activity, and that's interesting because it's the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex, and these three regions together are implicated in self-referential processing. And we know that social exclusion on a behavioral level induces negative self-reflective processing. So it just increases social uncertainty, distress, rumination. And the fact that these regions have been implicated in negative self-reflective processing indicates that during peer rejection, individuals with a history of child maltreatment might increase their negative self-reflective processes. And that might consist of vulnerability factor to the development of mental health disorders later on in life. So, in sum, we know that child adversity in the form of maltreatment impacts on emotional brain structure and function in the form of a smaller dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, persistent amygdala hypervigilance to stress, to emotional phases, and increased MPFC response to peer rejection. So, the question really is this then it? Is this deterministic in any way? No, it's not. Because we found this in both patients with a history of maltreatment who were patients who had a current depression or anxiety, but also in healthy controls. And that made us think like, what actually, we can't really determine who goes on to develop psychopathology yet. And so we thought maybe we're not approaching this in the right manner. Maybe we should look at investigating who stays resilient, so who's doing well after maltreatment. And if you want to investigate resilience after child maltreatment, it's kind of a big field, so there's a lot and lot of literature. So in starting this research project, I wanted to kind of see what others had done, and I found a really interesting review on studies that investigated resilience after child maltreatment. But the review wasn't really helpful because all those studies defined resilience in a different manner. They define it as a score of below the sample median of non-maltreated children, or as the top 40% of the entire sample of maltreated children, or just as the absence of psychopathology. And they suggested, the authors of the review suggested that in order to be able to better determine what resilience after child maltreatment means, we first need to start with an appropriate quantification of what resilience actually is. So a group of authors, me included, suggested a resilience framework last year. And we said that resilience means the maintenance or quick recovery of mental health during or after exposure to significant stressors. And what we mean with that is that resilience actually refers to a dynamic process. So it can only assessed after a stressor in the form of functioning. So you look at how well someone is doing after difficult life circumstances. And that also means that resilience is not a predisposition. It's not stable, it fluctuates, it changes over time. And it's also not related to one specific genotype or a brain correlate. It's rather, there are stable traits or predispositions that facilitate resilient responses, but they are called resilience factors. So the idea here is that you might have a certain genotype that might facilitate you having less amygdala reactivity in response to stress, and that a genotype would then be a resilience factor. The adaptive response to stress is what we would call a resilience mechanism. So you would have lower responses to stress, and therefore you'd be functioning resiliently. And then when you want to determine what resilience means after child adversity, you also have to think about, well, what kind of functioning are you looking at? So the functioning should be relevant to what the stressor is related to. So it's really important to acknowledge that resilience after child adversity might not be the same as resilience after child sexual abuse or child maybe resilience after a significant traumatic injury. And it's also really important to not look at one domain of functioning, but to look at across a range of domains. And especially in the case of child adversity, where we know that it's related to, it has a negative impact on emotional, behavioral, social functioning, you need to not only look at mental health or academic functioning, but you need to look across a range of domains. The last thing is that in determining how resilient people are, it's really important to look at the severity of what they've experienced. And the reason for that is really simple. If you have two children and they're both doing equally well across a range of domains, but one of the children has had really severe early life experiences and the other one had moderate experiences, then this one is much more severe. So it's really important to take the severity of maltreatment or an adverse experiences into account. So how do you do that in a big sample? So I wanted to quantify, to see whether or not we could quantify resilient functioning in a community cohort study. And I used data from the NSPN study. NSPN is a study that we have here in Cambridge. It's an accelerated longitudinal design study of population representative adolescents from London and Cambridge. And about 2,400 filled in the questionnaire at home, and 1,600 filled in the questionnaire a year later. And they were really healthy. They reported low levels of psychopathology and normal behaviors. They had average mental well-being. And what I did in that sample is I just looked at all the questionnaires that we had that were in any way related to mental health. And I used a data reduction technique to extract one factor score that explained variance across all these different measures. And I did the same for their early life experiences. So I had one score for how well they were functioning and one score for their early life experiences. And I just regressed the two on each other. And what you get is a predicted model of how well someone should be doing based on the community cohort. But you also get their residual score that indicates how much better or worse someone is doing that when compared to peers with average levels of similar levels of adverse experiences. And you can then think of the fact that how much better or worse someone is doing compared to their peers is explained on various interrelated explanatory levels, including genetic influences and environmental influences. So I wanted to investigate whether or not we could find support for this idea by looking at environmental influences. And I looked at social support from family and friends, and what I found is that these residual scores were highly related to friendship support, but also to family support. But as resilience is dynamic, it's really important to study these relationships over time. And what I did is I fitted the structural equation model to look at these relationships over time. And what I found was this, and I'll highlight the most important one. I found that friendships predict resilient functioning over time in adolescence. But it wasn't the case that this is explained by the fact that if you're more resilient, you're just nicer to hang around, and therefore friendships predicts resilience, because you would then expect that resilience predicts friendships, but we didn't find that. We actually didn't find any support for that. So this suggests that friendship support increases resilient functioning over a year in adolescence. And then we thought, well, what other resilience factors could we identify and could we study? And this is a study by my MPhil student, Adrian Dahl Askelund, and he thought we should look at positive memory recall. And the reason for that is that recalling positive memories actually lowers cortisol and mood response to stress in an experiment. And reactivating positive memories also has been found to alleviate stress-induced depression-like behavior in mice. So it might be a really important factor that might facilitate resilient responses. And we want to study that. So what we looked at is whether or not positive memory specificity, so the ability to recall positive events that happened to you in the past, whether or not that was related to lower, to improved mood or morning cortisol. Morning cortisol is highly related as a trait to depression. So what we found is that positive memory specificity predicted lower dysphoric mood, so it improved mood over time, and it also lowered morning cortisol, so it also improved biological vulnerability to depression in these children. And then we wanted to better understand this relationship with dysphoric mood, because what we had used was a questionnaire based on a cognitive theory where where stress increases negative self-referential thinking and therefore increases depression. So we wanted to study this relationship in this sample, and what we found is that increased ability to recall positive memories actually lowered negative self-referential thoughts, and then that lowered depressive symptoms. So there was a full mediation, but that mediation was only apparent for those individuals who had experienced recent negative life events. So that we didn't find an effect of positive specific memory in those individuals who didn't have any stress. So we can say that positive memory specificity lowers morning cortisol and dysphoria over time, and it does so by acting as a resilience factor in response to negative life events. It lowers negative self-referential thinking, and thereby it lowers depressive symptoms later on in life. And this is really important because research has shown that you can actually intervene on positive memory specific recall. You can actually help children in their ability to recall positive memories. So then we thought, well, this is exciting. What other factors are there that might help? So we did a systematic review, and this is work by Jess Fritz, who is my PhD student. And we said that we wanted to look at all the literature that looked at child adversity and psychopathology, and both in a really broad way. But we did say that we needed the resilience factor to be a mediator or a moderator on the relationship between child adversity and psychopathology. And in order to be a mediator or a moderator, we also need to have a longitudinal design. So we looked at all the longitudinal studies, and what we found is that there are lots, 3,100 in total, but we could only include 22. And I think that says a lot about the literature as well, that there are lots and lots of cross-sectional studies, but not so many longitudinal studies looking at these relationships. And those 22 studies suggested support for 46 different resilience factors that might operate on an individual level, like cognitive reappraisal, mental flexibility, rumination, high self-esteem. They worked on a family level, like family cohesion and support, and on a community level, like friendships. And but then we thought, well, that's nice that we now know that there are lots and lots of resilience factors, but we also know that all these resilience factors are interrelated. So if you have high self-esteem, that might help you in the way that you interact with people, and that might therefore improve your friendships. So we wanted to understand these relationships a bit better. And we used network analyses or graph theory to do so. And what we found is that in individuals with a history of that had an optimal or normal environment in early life, This relationship was in the way that you would expect it. Self-esteem had a positive relationship with friendships, family support had a positive relationship with friendships, but in those with a history of child adversity, these relationships were negative. So they were in the opposite of what you would expect, suggesting that the interrelation between resilience factors might work dysfunctionally. And that also means that if you would identify or if you would improve one resilience factor in the network for individuals without adversity, it might help. It might spread through the network by improving other resilience factors. But for those individuals with history of maltreatment or adversity, that doesn't work because it might negatively influence the level of other resilience factors. And then we looked at their relationship with distress, and we found that those relationships were absolutely normal. So the resilience factors in both networks had a negative relationship with distress. So they did work as resilience factors. It was just the interrelation between these resilience factors that was working dysfunctionally in these children. So in sum, in individuals with a history of maltreatment, it seems to be that resilience factors are negatively interrelated, and that intervening on these negative interrelations might actually be important in reducing mental health disorders in individuals with a history of adversity. So, in sum, I hope I've shown you that adversity increases impacts on the developing brain by making individuals more vulnerable to the development of psychopathology through amygdala hypervigilance and increased medial prefrontal cortex responses to social rejection. We also shown that there are 46 amenable factors in adolescence that will facilitate resilient functioning, including friendships and positive memory recall. However, that these factors might be dysfunctionally related to each other, and that intervening on these interrelations might prove crucial in reducing mental health disorders after adversity. Thank you very much. I'd like to